Okay, let's get started. So, good evening, everybody, and welcome back after the 1 week break. We're back for the second half of Mark's series, which has been going great. I hope you're all enjoying it as much as I have been. Couple of quick things. Most of you have heard this before. We use the Q&A button to send comments or questions to me, which I will relay to Mark, either at the end or in the middle, depending upon how he flows his presentation. The other thing to mention to you, I've mentioned it before, next Thursday we intend to have Mark in the Brubeck Room at the library next Thursday at 7 o'clock to do his concluding lecture in person. Now, we will still stream it for those of you who cannot come to the library next week, but we thought we would conclude the series with him in the building. And to sweeten it up a little bit, we'll have some refreshments, a little wine and cheese and cookies and lemonade, and a little chance to just chat a little bit amongst ourselves and with him after his lecture is over. So you're going to get an email from me either tonight or early tomorrow morning simply asking you, do you plan to come? I just need to have an idea so that I can set the room up correctly with the seating, and also I know how much refreshment stuff to buy. So you'll get that email. Please respond to me, as quickly as you can so I can get our setup people with the correct instructions. With that, I am turning this over to Mark for session 3. Mark.
Thank you, Michael. And I appreciate, again, being invited again and again. I appreciate the extraordinary attendance. I assume that some critical mass of you have been coming to most or all of these. I also want to thank Michael for making it clear that just having me in the building is not enough. He's going to sweeten it with food and drink. I think that's very wise. This man is an event planner. So John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, perhaps more than any of the quartet of books we're doing for this series of essentially novels of the American 1930s, shows again just how extraordinarily different these books are from the American literature and the America that we saw in the first decades of the century, our last series. He lived from 1902 to 1968, and in his 66 years, a life cut short because he died during the 1968 flu pandemic as a result of pulmonary and coronary problems. He'd been a lifelong smoker. In those 66 years, he published 33 books. That's a remarkable output: 16 novels, 6 works of nonfiction, 2 short story collections. The Grapes of Wrath won the Pulitzer Prize. Shortly thereafter, he won the Nobel Prize, or after, largely with a lot of recognition to The Grapes of Wrath. And we have to say at the outset, it is one of those books in world literature whose assessment by any measure has transcended a consideration of its literary merit. You can make a case for it being a great work of literature on its artifice, the way it's put together, although a lot of people have assaulted it for being, and this is both professional critics and your everyday reader, for being sentimental, filled with stereotypes, heavy-handed symbolism, a melodramatic plot, frank dialogue, leftist politics, and so on. But in fact, a lot of those charges would be seen without merit when you realize that the melodrama of the plot is based on what was actually happening. Robert DeMott, D-E-M-O-T-T, a good critic, a scholar of Steinbeck's work, describes this book as one that has a participatory aesthetic. And by that he means the novel is meant to have you feel what's happening. And the remarkable thing about this book, the chapters, roughly half of them, actually 16 of the 30 that are reportage or white papers or journalism, the ones that don't have the Joad family in it, not quite every other chapter, but close. They're called intercalary, like February 29th, an insertion to make things come out right, and the calories related to calendar. Just think of it as an insertion. Those insertion chapters are really what Steinbeck wanted people to read. And the people like my college students, when I've done this, who believe that he wrote the story and then added in the insertion to give it historical heft, to make it more credible. It's just the opposite. And if you accept that, you understand the brilliance of his enterprise in writing what he called a truly American book. What he wanted to do was he wanted people to confront the poverty, the starvation, the bold manipulation of the government and conglomerates and corporations, the rape of the land, so that the land of plenty was not being used to feed American citizens, but just the opposite. The manipulation of workers, the breaking of strikes, the fanning the flames of anti-communism. That's what he wanted to report on. He did a lot of investigative journalism. The Tom of the introduction, and who gives his first name to Tom Joad, was a remarkable government worker named Tom Collins, who kept assiduous notes of interviews and what was happening. And what Steinbeck said was, in order to get people to believe the things that were factual, he needed to put poetry around it so that people would read the book. So the story of the Joads is meant to be emotional, sentimental, melodramatic, moving, to put a human face on what he really wanted to write about, which was what is happening in America. The Grapes of Wrath purposely invokes the Battle Hymn of the Republic, because Steinbeck saw another civil war between those who have and those who haven't, a civil war of the 20th century. And so this is one of those rare books that has an agenda and is quite bald about it. In that way, he joins at least two other great 20th century American writers, Theodore Dreiser, who very much was trying to write a kind of sociological attack on America and American values, and probably his classic is American Tragedy, published in 1925, which, by the way, is number 16 on the 100 best modern library books. This book, The Grapes of Wrath, is number 10. And with the exception of The Sound and the Fury, which is up around 6, The Grapes of Wrath scores higher on that 100 best novels of modern library than any other American novel I've been doing. So American Tragedy by Dreiser, and then a writer that's not read enough, John Dos Passos, wrote a trilogy that collectively is called USA, published in 1930, 1932, and 1936, which not only takes the same very strident attack on the corruption of American values, but uses a lot of techniques that Steinbeck borrowed about mixed modes. It has been said, and I'm one of the people who said it, that if you take any number of 19th century and early 20th century British novels, and you change the title to Great Expectations, in more cases than not, it will fit. That is, the British novel from Jane Austen up until the early 20th century is often about the middle class wanting, as Oliver Twist said, more. And a great many novels, whether they're comedies with expectations fulfilled or tragedies with expectations confounded, could be called Great Expectations, and it would fit. Well, I could say that you could take a great many American novels and use Dreiser's extraordinary title, An American Tragedy. This book could have been called An American Tragedy. Something would be lost, but this is an American tragedy. So given that it's meant to be a novel with an agenda, unapologetically, given what Robert DeMott has said, and I agree that it has a participatory aesthetic, I'm not only going to continue what we've done for the last few sessions, but hope to do more so and turn it over to all of you. Someone I know quite well teaches literature in high schools before she retired and taught in sort of prep schools. And she did American literature quite frequently, including The Grapes of Wrath. And I asked her when I knew I'd be talking tonight how her students found it. They found those insertion chapters horrible to read, and she's sure they glossed over them. She did her best to hold them to its content by quizzes, but they did not sign up for infomercials, and they resented that wasn't the story. They found the ending scene of the breastfeeding creepy. I think that's the word she said came up often. I have to say, I know many adult readers who find that ending creepy, which is regrettable. But it turns out that those students were not prepared at their young age, I think, for the power of this book. And what is the power? It's partly that it is so passionate about its theme that it uses every kind of fictional technique. So not only the realism of the Jodes and the poignancy, but biblical symbolism, heavy-handed maybe, but Exodus clearly, a Rose of Sharon from the Song of Songs. There's a character named Noah who leaves them by a body of water. There's a flood at the end. There's a character who is a sort of new kind of holy man whose initials are JC, not subtly, who sacrifices himself to be arrested to save another man, even though he's not guilty. There is Tom Joad, who becomes a kind of figure of Christian community and Christian charity. There's the overarching Christian sense, and not solely Christian. I mean, other religions share this ethic, but in the novel, it's cast as Christian because these people are Christian, Ma especially, of giving to others. One of the things Ma has to learn is that caring only about your family is just another version of egoism. And she has to realize maybe she should leave some stew in the pot for the other children that aren't hers. When they set out to travel, there are 12 travelers on the car and the truck, biblical number. There are 12 railroad cars near the end. They lose fully half of their traveling party. They shrink from 12 to 6. They lose Grandpa to death in chapter 13. They lose Noah through a kind of indifference and Grandma to death in chapter 18. They lose Casey to arrest and Connie to abandonment. He just leaves in chapter 20. And famously, they lose Tom in chapter 28, who is going but will be everywhere there's trouble. Still one of the most remarkable passages in American literature. And a year later, directed by John Ford, who won the Best Director for Grapes of Wrath, a remarkable monologue by Henry Fonda. If you've never seen it or haven't seen it lately, I'm sure it's on YouTube. So there's the biblical stuff. There's the matter-of-factness of description. And if you want to remind yourself, especially if you haven't recently read or reread this novel, of just how good Steinbeck is, read the first chapter of the novel, second chapter, the first narrative chapter, where Tom gets picked up by the truck driver who knows that he's been released from prison, and they spar a little bit about that. Read that for the clarity, the eye for detail, the matter-of-factness without any sentiment or symbolism. It is a brilliant piece of writing. And then right after you read that, read the last chapter of the novel, which is just the opposite. There's a flood, there's a storm. It's very high tension, very emotional. She's just given birth to a stillborn baby. She's weak. She and her mother make eye contact, and the two women immediately understand what they're going to do. That remarkable ending with the mysterious smile. a radically different kind of literature from the second chapter of the novel. The first narrative chapter and the last narrative chapter could not be more different. It's the same writer, the same book, and you see versions of both strains, both registers when you read the novel. So I'm going to stop there. That's a lot to say. The novel has been attacked by many people, including professional critics, as not a very well-written book, has a good heart. Harold Bloom said that it's a compassionate story, but Steinbeck is not a good stylist. He doesn't know how to write a plot. He later revised that to say there's no measure of literature that would not hold this book in esteem. But those people were allowing that it wasn't very well written in also conceding that it was a book of enormous effect. So I'm going to pause there. Well, I'll have more to say, and turn to Michael to see. I'm especially interested if anyone reading it for the first time or coming back to it after a long while has anything to say about what it's like to read this now quite old book, again, 1930s, in 2022, which is now nearly half over. Michael?
Okay, Mark. So, folks, just use the Q&A button. You don't have to pose a significant question or make a huge statement. Just give us your reactions along the lines Mark was just talking about. I'm just going to mention one thing while we're letting people do that. I went back I reread this book after many, many years of having read it many years ago. And I guess, well, the first point I mentioned to Mark earlier was that it didn't grab me as much as the first two books in this series. And I think part of that is really just because I'd read it before, so I kind of knew quite a bit about it and the plot and where things were going. But one thing I noticed, but I didn't understand the full significance of it, was these alternation of chapters. And what I was finding was that I was actually liking the reported chapters more than the narrative chapters.
Yeah, and Michael, if I could offer an opinion about that, that may be unfounded, but I'm going to guess it's because you remembered the narrative chapters and the story better than you remembered the insertion chapters.
Oh,
That you probably were encountering. I don't mean you skip them, although that's not impossible for anybody, but it's quite possible that the insertion chapters didn't register with you as a first-time reader. I've made the comment before that I've had students who tell me that they like Moby Dick as long as they can skip the parts about the whale. And that when they see quotation marks and they know that people are talking and it's actually human interaction, they pay attention. That may have something to do with it. I don't know.
got it. Well, we got some comments. I'll just take them in order. First one, I read something that said the book was banned in a number of jurisdictions. Is it clear what caused the ban? Was it the breastfeeding scene or a conservative community's reaction to a leftist piece?
Yeah, well, the problem is that places don't always enumerate what is the cause of banning. And there's certainly a lot of hot button items in the book. It has been challenged and banned many times for its frank nature, the outrage of a woman bearing her breast and letting a man be fed on her at the end of the novel, certainly. But the sort of frankness of the conversation, the fact that people, Tom kills a man and escapes with the support of his family, no respect for American property, no respect for the law. 1939 is when it was published, so people were always worried about leftist propaganda. It does not talk about the American capitalist system very well. There are lots of reasons to have the book be challenged or banned. It is not an anti-American book, but it is a book that is anti-America of the values that have been promoted that have turned the Dust Bowl into a Dust Bowl and that have taken the land of plenty and leased it out to corporations that control it The idea, everything, when Eleanor Roosevelt toured the California farm systems in 1940 or so, she said that she never doubted that the things reported by this novel were true. And she now saw again that it was. And Steinbeck was a great fan of the Roosevelts, but he was very vindicated by that fact. The idea that they over advertised for labor in order to glut the market so that they could pay people less and pit poor workers against poor workers. That was done intentionally. Those things have all been corroborated. But there are people who don't want to hear that. I was telling Michael before we started, I had neighbors in the neighborhood that I was raised in Queens in the 50s and 60s who did not believe that anybody went to bed hungry in America then, in those decades, or ever. Maybe, they said, maybe there are people in ghettos, and they knew what they meant by that, or really poor rural areas through neglect, but it's not done wholesale. And the 30s was a time, terrible climate problems that were nobody's doing. But to repair what was done by the Dust Bowl storms, and multiple ones, the government and corporations not only didn't step up, they used it to their advantage.
Sure. So I got a quick follow-up along the same lines, and then I've got two other comments that are completely different. So we'll just give you the quick follow-up. You already touched on it a bit. Did the reactions to the book follow partisan political lines? In other words, did liberals like it and conservatives didn't?
Yeah, I don't have expertise in that area. I'm not politically savvy about how that parses out. I can tell you this, that when the book came out in 1939, Hitler had his government agents make the book available in German translation during the war on the grounds that it would show the German people how ineffective and how cruel the American government was to its own citizens. He was sure that it would help the war effort. He found out that most German readers were surprised to find that no matter how poor you were in America, you could own a truck and a car and drive through multiple states. And when Hitler found out that that's what people had as a takeaway, he had the book removed.
Huh.
So when you talk about, how do people see a book? How do they react? He thought it would help the war effort. It just backfired on him.
Interesting.
And it continues to be a book, I'm told. I mean, it sold 14 million copies through its first 60 or 70 years. It's a book that is very often read in other countries because people are fascinated not only by the story and the argument, the sociological political argument, they are astounded that you could write this and live, that the author of the book could write this, not only live, but win a Pulitzer Prize for the book, a Nobel Prize for his overall achievement. Astounded. And in general, the books that get a lot of foreign readers, massive numbers of foreign readers, are books that show America in broad epical expanse, like Gone with the Wind, which has always been an international bestseller, or that shows something about the American system in a way that other nations are surprised you can write about.
Got it. So let me give you these two comments before you react, because they're both about an emotional response to the book. First one, I read the book many years ago, but I found that I had to stop reading it this time halfway through because I found it so painful. It must be one of the saddest stories ever written. And the other comment is, the novel hit me hard, in part because of Red River Valley in the film was a song her dad, who died when she was in college, used to sing, and really I was shaken for days. And I also found a beautiful illustrated copy at another library.
Yeah. Well, I certainly not only respect, but feel the pain of the reader who said you have to stop because it's too painful. And I don't know if my friend Meg is in the audience tonight, but I'll channel her because this is relevant. She was exchanging emails about Their Eyes Were Watching God and saying that her daughter, Margaret, and Meg, I hope you don't mind my using first names. I'm purposely not using your last name. That Meg admired Their Eyes Were Watching God, but Margaret found it too painful to think of how Janie, for all her independence and talent, was still a wife, and a wife who was brutalized and mistreated and so on, and that Margaret could not get away from that in order to appreciate the kinds of things that I was pointing out. And I said to Meg, the mother, in our exchange, that I admire Margaret. I'm going to say Margaret's maybe in her early 30s, but in that range. I admired Margaret's response because that would be my daughter's, a little bit older, late 30s, early 40s response, which is, Dad, I don't care about what you want to say about literary technique. In 2022, I can't read this novel and not be angry or demoralized or upset. And I want to say, that's to the novel's credit. You know, if you have Margaret's response to Janie, it's because Nora Zeal Hurston wrote Janie that way. And I feel that anyone who says one of the problems with reading The Grapes of Wrath is it's just too sad, I admire that and feel that too. I've never had an attitude towards this book where my analysis of it is so technical or academic that I don't feel what it is to be around people who are starving. When that boy hidden in the barn says to these people who are coming in, concerned that they're the owner, that he's learned that his father has effectively been starving himself so the son can eat, hasn't eaten in 6 days, can't keep food down, he needs soup or milk. You very rarely encounter such a bald depiction of deprivation, true deprivation, in any novel, yet alone a classic American novel. It is heartrending. And I think it's to the credit of the author and the reader to have that response.
Okay. Another comment, Rose of Sharon's mysterious smile links her to the Judaic-Christian tradition in art and the Bible.
Yeah. It does. And, you know, she's kind of empty-headed. You know, she's a young mother, wife, thinking about getting a place to live. I think what sends Connie away is her talking about maybe they'll peel off and find a place to live. And of course, she goes through the horrible experience of coming to term, or maybe prematurely, during this horrendous ordeal of the trek. Goes through terrible experiences, screams uncontrollably, and then give birth to a stillborn baby in terrible circumstances. It'd be terrible in any circumstances. And then is asked by her mother without a spoken request, do you know what you have to do? And steps up. And I think what we're supposed to understand is that there's a Madonna-like quality in this mother who has no child. And I do think it's channeling not the Virgin Mary as a virgin, but a kind of supernatural embodiment, a blessed maternity, the Holy Mother, when she does this remarkable act. Steinbeck got no greater opposition from his publisher, not even to expletives that he used in the novel, than the breastfeeding scene at the end. And he insisted that they could not remove that or change a word of it. They wanted one of the editors, not his editor, not his personal editor, but one of the people at the publishing house thought that they should make the man who's being fed someone who is known to the Joads, who appeared earlier in the novel, so that it doesn't have the sense of an absolute stranger, that she's bearing her breast to a stranger, missing completely the Christian idea that of the Good Samaritan. My neighbor is anyone I meet. And it's the fact that this is a stranger, somebody just come upon, someone in need, someone not known to them, not a family member. One of the things that Ma has to learn is that if charity means anything, your own are not just the people you live with, it's everybody. That's the radical sense of what the novel is arguing. And Rosa Sharon gets that somehow by kind of osmosis. And that mysterious smile not just connects her to that tradition, the sort of all-knowing alma mater, right? Alma means nourishing. The nourishing mother, literally giving the milk of human kindness. In the midst of a flood, water, which is associated with an Old Testament punishment and dispensation, you have this nurturing mother figure of the New Testament, the J.C. Casey, who rejects religion but embraces the early Christian notion of a community of charitable people. I think that's quite intentional. I think it's beautifully handled, and it is offset by the fact that when he wants to write about details of how Jode meets that truck driver in the beginning, and how you notice so many things about even how that truck driver is talking to the waitress, has a kind of detailed concreteness that shows you that Steinbeck can write that way when he needs to.
Yeah. And actually, as a quick follow-up on the ending, the ending is uplifting, raises the tragedy to a tone of hopefulness, a giving of life to another, a stranger. The loss of her infant gives Rose of Sharon a purpose to give life to another person.
Right. And of course, when we talk about in my description of this series that's on the website and that I wrote some months ago when Michael and I were talking about what books we were going to do and why, that it really raises the question of what does it mean to be an American? I think of the fact that when they were forming religious colonies in New England, and they were talking about the fact that any group of people who wanted to worship together, any number, could govern themselves, and that you didn't need a bishop, you didn't need to be Episcopal, there needed to be no central church. You could agree together to have a community of X number of people. And Anne Hutchinson came along and said famously, can that number be one? Can any number of people who govern themselves in a religious community, can it be one? And they said, no, that's too low a number. And they essentially exiled her for being anti-religion. Emily Dickinson would have said one is a good number. I can be a church of one. And in the same way, what this novel's, differently, but in the same spirit, this novel is saying, if you really do believe in the notion of either Christian community or the democratic ideal that all people are created equal, then everybody is your neighbor. But of course, that's not something most people are up to doing, even if they think they are. And when Steinbeck said to his publisher, when she offers her breast, it shouldn't be any different than if she were offering bread if she had it. She happens to have milk, and milk and not bread is what he needs. And anybody with any sense of intelligence and compassion would say, there's no reason not to do this except your perverse sense of decorum. And he won that battle, even though they were convinced that it would tank the sales of the book. And again, many people did attack it for that reason and others, but it survived the test of time.
Yeah. So I've got one more comment that goes back to the two-part nature of the structure of the book. I reread this book in January 2020, found it relevant to today with the pressure of immigrants throughout the world and prejudice. Hard to eliminate the impact of the movie. The fictional part of the Jode's experience was gripping, yet I found the non-fictional, like social commentary, equally powerful. Does this two-part form weaken the novel?
Yeah, well, I appreciate this reader asking me that question, but it should be clear that from what I've said in this first half hour plus, no, it doesn't in my view. But it may to high school readers that my friend taught for years, it may to other readers, like my students who don't like the whale stuff about Moby Dick. But if you want to step back and say, what's the intention of the author? What's the intention of the novel? Is it successful? Moby Dick is not just a story about a guy trying to capture a whale. It's about a way of life where the whaliness of the whale, I'm using a kind of expression that Connecticut's own Wallace Stevens used to use, the whaliness, everything that's whale-like about the whale gets used in industry, the bones, the ambergris, the blubber, oil. If you are in a fishing community, your life is infused with fishiness. Moby Dick is a celebration of what used to be called the anatomy of something, that is, break it down into all its parts. Wallace Stevens said in one of his poems that the natives of the rain are rainy men. We would say rainy people, but he said the natives of the rain are rainy men. Their art is a rainy art. Their music has the sound of rain in it. If you live in a climate, the climate affects your culture. That's why nobody was wrestling in the nude outside in Oslo, but they were doing it in Athens. That's why the Mediterranean islands gave us Greek tragedy and Northern Europe gave us Calvinism. I'm quite serious. Climate affects culture. So Moby Dick is a celebration of the culture of whaling alongside a story. And you could say that for some readers, does the whaliness of the book detract from the story? Well, yes, if you only want to read the story. And I respect that some people may just want to read the adventure story and are disappointed when there's a lot of other stuff. I think this novel succeeds because it alternates almost geometrically, but not quite, between telling you the truth and telling you the fiction that brings the truth to life.
Got it.
Wow, it sounds like I wrote that, but I didn't.
Well,
Somebody write that. I hope they're recording this.
our audience is good at prompting you.
Yes. So
You could go on, Mark.
Okay, so I want to say that certainly one of the things that's happening, and none of this should be meant to imply that there was something deficient about Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, and so on. The nature of culture, the nature of art, the nature of nature, the nature of representation. So the 19th century novel was very interested in social issues and tried to create dramas of sentiment. We associate that with a lot of Victorian novels. Think of Dickens, think of the Bronte sisters. Reader, I Married Him. Tried to put passion and sentiment and emotions in to elevate people's concern for the disenfranchised, whether it be the poor or women. And that whole movement was a pendulum swing against the rationalism of the 18th century, where the dominant mode of the novel in things like Moll Flanders, Tom Jones, Smollett, and other writers was satire. And of course, satire suggests that your standards are quite clear and you're mocking people who fall short of them. Jonathan Swift would be a good example. The hallmark of the Victorian novel was tragedy, with the idea that things are not going the way they should, and rather than satirizing it comically or wittily, you bemoan it. That's because the way people thought about society and culture changed. When you get to the early part of the 20th century, in England certainly, when we talked about Virginia Woolf and others, they had a sense that human nature had radically changed, and that it was old-fashioned to talk about the idea that to depict someone becoming themselves, you had to watch them over years or decades, like the Forsyte Saga, or years like Pip in Great Expectations, and see how this coming of age person, think about how many coming of age novels we have done, how this coming of age person has developed into an adult. People like Virginia Woolf and D.H. Lawrence said, if character means anything, it's who you are. Conrad also, it's who you are at any moment of your existence. So you don't need 24 years. You could do it in 24 hours. And you can learn everything there is to know about Clarissa Dalloway in an afternoon if you write the way Virginia Woolf writes. And so she was not interested, Virginia Woolf, in writing the kind of book like this book that would, and I'm going to quote Steinbeck here, he said, I tried to write the book the way lives are lived, not the way books are written. He wanted to, he said, to rip a reader's nerves to rags. So for the reader who said he or she had to stop, Steinbeck would be happy. Wanted to rip a reader's nerves to rags. Virginia Woolf said in one of her notebooks that she tired of these other novels that when you finish them made you feel you should send a check somewhere. Now, she wasn't mocking them. She herself was quite philanthropic. I suspect she sent many checks to many places, but that's not the art she wanted to write. Walt Whitman was bigger than the page. He had an ego that he thought channeled the American exuberance, but Emily Dickinson did not. And you couldn't find two more different poets, and they were writing in the same decades. So this writer, Steinbeck, and the two writers we read up to now of the Jewish experience and the African-American woman's experience are seeing the novel as capable of doing something quite different from what the earlier novelists thought. And of course, in any given time period, different writers can be very different, even though they're writing in the same decade. I recently did the novel Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr, Doerr, of All the Light We Cannot See, in one of my private book groups. And most people liked the book very much. I was very impressed by it. I recommend it. But a number of people really disliked what they thought was the gimmick about it. There are no spoilers in what I'm about to tell you. It's set in 3 different time periods. It has different narrators. There's a lot going on. It's a kind of wacky book. And one woman objected to the fact that it seems to be trendy, that the novel has to be set in the past of the 12th century and in the present and in the future sci-fi life, and thought that that was just somebody trying to go with the flow. And I was suggesting that it was more serious than that, that there's no reason why the novel had to have a novel, the novel as a form, had to have a beginning, middle, and end in that order. That's been done for decades. But even though we can say, I like a Jane Austen novel where I can follow everything in chronological order, and I'm not confused by different narrators, or Dickens, or X number of writers who do that, I recognize that that's not the only way we experience reality. And we experience reality as we sit here by thinking back to when I was talking to my neighbors in the 1960s about hunger in America. And maybe one or more of you has imagined something outlandish as you've been daydreaming through this talk. I'm not offended. That's the nature of nature. That's the nature of human nature. And those are novelists like Anthony Doerr, who is trying to channel a different way to think about reality. And I think it's very exciting. And when one of the people in that group said that she couldn't finish the book, and she thought that this was very much a 21st century affectation, she said, you know, when novels were first written, they were much more matter of fact in the way they presented things. And I countered by saying that what many people think of as the first world novel published during Shakespeare's lifetime was Cervantes' Don Quixote. Don Quixote is not a book with a beginning, middle, and end. It is a wacky book. It is at least as wacky and gimmicky, I'm not using that word because that was the word used, as anything you'll ever read. And many people think of it as the first novel. Writers are always using their imagination to push the limits of what representation is like. And I think it's one of the glories of literature. So this novel is an intensely realistic depiction that also uses sentiment and melodrama and symbolism and even a kind of clunky working class interaction. People talk about the Apollonian ideal of art or presentation is elegance and grace and symmetry, but that there's also a Dionysian ideal of disorder and chaos and what you might call clunkiness, a kind of passion that seems not tamed, that seems rough-edged. This book is much more Dionysian than it is Apollonian, and there's place for that in the American canon. Hemingway has more ragged edges than Fitzgerald, and there's room for both of them. I just want to make sure, Michael, that if there are other people who would like to comment, again, I appreciate if people do, letting people have some say, even if I don't always answer their questions. I'm more interested, in fact, in comments than questions, but I'll do my best with either.
Sure. No, I've got my eye on it, and we'll let people have an opportunity to send us some more reactions. One of the things that just occurred to me thinking about this book is it's unrelenting in the sense that I don't think that I remember even I don't even think there's a single moment of levity in the entire thing from like the first sentence. That's what I mean by unrelenting. It's like someone who's almost haranguing you and never ever just like letting up.
Yeah, I do think there's some felicity in some of the exchanges between people. I think that first narrative chapter, chapter 2, in how Tom handles himself by feeling that that guy is sizing him up. And that's the first invocation where that truck driver says, "I'm not sticking my nose in your yard." And that raises for the first time the overarching question is, am I my brother's keeper? Should I be poking my nose into your yard? And the guy has just said that he's taken courses to be very attentive. And Tom Joad believes that the guy is purposely ragging him about the fact that he knows his secret, when in fact, I think that's not the case. But of course, Joad is sensitive about it. But he's not sensitive about saying that he was in prison, released early, and it was for homicide. And it's clear that if the guy took that the wrong way, he's ready to do violence. I mean, Tom Joad, not yet 30, has a hot temper. The novel is capable of playing with registers. And I think some of the descriptions of that truck driver, the way he talks about taking courses to improve himself, the way he interacts with that waitress, there's a kind of muted wit in some of that. But it is true, if you call this an American tragedy, or if you appreciate the full meaning of the grapes of wrath, which is that there's going to be a harvest of violence. Howe's the battle hymn of the Republic was about marching into combat because we've had enough. Justice has to be served. The grapes of wrath are going to come home. The chickens are going to come home to roost.
Yeah, so I think the other thing I was thinking of along those lines was the scene later on in the book in the other diner with I think her name is May, the counter waitress, and the beginning of that, it's kind of lighthearted, and you're kind of saying to yourself, Oh, catching a little break here, a little light-hearted interlude. She's bantering with the truck drivers that come in and everything. And then when the family comes in and they're trying to buy like a loaf of bread for 10 cents, and then the entire thing just turns so dark so fast. And the husband who runs the diner is telling her, just give him the bread already. And she's like, but the bread's got to be only 15 cents because I have to give you the whole loaf. And the guy's only got a dime. It was just, I got my hopes up that it was going to be a little kind of a light interlude, and it turned dark.
Yeah. So here's a little bit of what I mean. And I want to say, none of this is to suggest that there's humor or comedy, although I do think there's a kind of wit. So on the first paragraph of chapter 2, the huge red transport truck, Oklahoma City Transport Company, the trucker who sat on the stool and rested his elbows on the counter and looked over his coffee at the lean and lonely waitress. He talked the smart, listless language of the roadsides to her. So that's a witty line. Lean and lonely waitress, the alliteration of lean and lonely, followed by listless language. He doesn't have anything invested in this. It doesn't even rise quite to the level of flirtation. And then we're told that, and I may not be able to find this because I don't think oh yes. On the paragraph that begins, the music stopped. Her exploring fingers had found a lump under her ear. She was trying to see it in a mirror behind the counter without letting the truck driver know. And so she pretended to push a bit of hair to neatness. The truck driver said, there was a big dance in Shawnee. I heard somebody got killed or something. You hear anything? No, said the waitress. And she lovingly fingered the lump under her ear. There's a kind of black comedy in that. Is this lump cancer? Is this lump a cyst? Is this lump something that's been there for a while and she hasn't noticed? She doesn't want him to know she has it. And he mentions a dance and somebody got killed. And of course, we know that many chapters later, there's a dance that is purposely broken up or is tried to be broken up, and someone could have gotten killed if the committees didn't handle it so well. Not laugh out loud funny, a kind of dark black comedy, but listless language captures perfectly that this guy has nothing invested in shooting the breeze, but he's doing.
It's interesting that you brought that in, because while you were making that comment, we had a comment from someone. First of all, said daydreaming through the talk. Hardly. But she said that oddly, the thing I recall most about Steinbeck's details is a tiny one, and it's the one about the waitress maneuvering to the mirror to try to notice the pimple.
Yeah. Well, the lump is probably more than a pimple, but yes, let me say, when I said earlier, and I was quite earnest about this, that if you to read that second chapter in its entirety, even if you just finished the novel, and then you were to read the last chapter of the novel in its entirety, you'll be struck about how proficient this one author is in these two very different modes of interaction. There's no symbolism, biblical weight, melodrama in that first chapter. This is a guy on parole with a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. And even the wit of how Jode says, yeah, I know what the sign says, but maybe you're a good guy and it's not your fault that your boss makes you ride a truck with the sticker in it. And then the narrator explains that the truck driver wants to be a good guy, and now he's in a bind because the way Jode framed the offer, he can't turn it down without looking bad. Well, he'll look bad because he's a good guy. Another person might say, the hell with you. That is so well reasoned on the level of human psychology and has nothing to do with the Bible, has nothing to do with deprivation. Tom doesn't even know yet that the homestead has been devastated, but it shows you what Steinbeck can do in that mode in the same novel where he can do extraordinary things in a different mode at the end. And if you've never read Travels with Charlie, another kind of remarkable book, nonfiction this time, with some great registers of writing, the different way you can write. I recommend that to you as well. So we're out of time now. I will look forward if we in fact pull it off next time that it's an in-person event. For the Heart is a Lonely Hunter, another book that I think fits the model of this. What is it to be an American? What is the American culture? What is the American character like? And again, I'm so grateful to see still numbers up in the 60s of people coming out or staying at home to listen or daydream. That's okay too. That's okay too. And thank you, Michael, as always.
Great. Well, thanks, Mark. Another great session. And thank you, everybody, for joining in and giving us your comments. And I think it was really good. I'm going to send that email out. So please let me know as early as you can if you're going to be one of our in-person attendees so I can get it all set up correctly. Either way, we'll see you next Thursday. Hope to see you in the Brubeck Room. Otherwise, we'll see you on the screen. And thanks again. Good evening, everybody.
Stay safe, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Mark.